Precious Heavenly Father, we just want to come to you again this morning, thanking you for the good night's rest and for this day. We want to thank you also for the opportunity of coming before you this morning and learning at your feet. We just ask that you will open up our minds and our understanding, that we will be able to comprehend the things that we're to hear. And we just ask also that you will be with Brother Parminder, that your Holy Spirit will place the proper words upon his lips and the proper thoughts upon his mind, that he can convey these things that are of so great importance to us at our time. And we just thank you, Lord, for every blessing that you give us, and we just lay our lives now into your hands, thanking you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.
And turn to Daniel 11. Yesterday we did a couple of things yesterday. Hopefully we cleared up an issue about the word vision in the book of Daniel, and there was a typo in Esod, and it was chapter 10 verse 16. So we addressed that issue yesterday, and then we started looking at Daniel chapter 8 verse 11. As we're looking at Daniel chapter 8 verse 11, before we did that, as a way of introduction, we went to Daniel 11. And the reason we did that is to set up some information that I think we need to understand when we go into Daniel chapter 8 verse 11. And the piece of information was this, so that we can just refresh our minds. Rome comes up 3 times. Pagan Rome, Papal Rome, and what we call modern Rome. And pagan Rome is going to take down 3 territories. Papal Rome is going to take down 3 territories. And modern Rome is going to take down 3 territories. This is Daniel 11, 40 to 45. This is Daniel 8 verse 9. And this is Daniel 7, and the exact verse escapes me. I think it's verse 8, maybe 8, I think. Verse 8. So, this is Papal Rome. Modern Rome. Pagan Rome. And what I think is demonstrable is that the title for the King of the North for each of these occurs before the plucking up or the taking down of these 3 territories, haunts, whichever language you want to use. And then they rule. I've done the schematic here for modern Rome, but modern Rome is a bit different. So maybe the reality, if we were to draw this line out accurately, it may not look exactly like that. We know that in our reform line for the 144,000 is slightly different to other reform lines. We have a combining of the messages. There are some intricacies that make it slightly different, and so it is with modern Rome, about taking down of the 3 territories and then the ruling, because this ruling actually happens within the back end of this time period here. There's a combining work that goes on here. without trying to open that up into another discussion, maybe that's the easiest way to say it. But I've just put these in a sequential order, these two things, but I think we'd actually really need to combine them at the end of the world. So the reason why this is important is because I think verse 11 in chapter 8 is going to show this truth being brought to view here. So we went to verse 14, Daniel 11 verse 14 yesterday. Read the verse again to refresh our minds. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish division, but they shall fall. So verse 14 introduces the statement, the robbers or breakers of God's people. And we can read the rest of this verse in a number of ways. I'm just reading the rest of the verse in a historical setting, not so much in a future or prophetic setting. When it says they shall exalt themselves, this exaltation occurs as a historical event in the time period where this power is now introduced. The robbers of God's people, this is pagan Rome. And they're going to begin to exalt themselves in the history of verse 14. And that exaltation can be understood prophetically at the end of the world, when it talks about the establishment of the vision and they shall fall. So that there are a number of things going on, but the exaltation is actually a historical event that's going on in that time period. And then verse 15 talks about a war between the king of the south and the king of the north. So there's the king of the north and the king of the south that's brought to view here. And then we spent our time in verse 16. So I want to go back into verse 16. Just as an initial overview, verse 16, now the king of the north, the title for this, is going to be handed over to pagan Rome. Pagan Rome is going to get this title of the king of the north. And I've begun the history of verse 16. I can't remember exactly what I said yesterday, but it's around, if I put 200 BC, I think 200 BC is a date that you can defend, and it's going to go right down to, let's read verse 16. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. So, verse 16, it can be understood in either the history of 63 BC, where he stands in the glorious land. Everybody's familiar with the history of 63 BC. This is Daniel 8 verse 9, 63 BC, one of the three powers that are taken down. But it can also, I think, be discussing AD 70, where Jerusalem's destroyed. But we'll go conservatively and take it to 63 BC. And then you can go into when you go into verse 17 to verse 22, it talks about pagan Rome and its interactions with Egypt and Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, Mark Antony, all of that history gets involved in this time period. And so that takes us right down to verse 22. To verse 22. And then we get into verse 23. So we'll read verse 23. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. So when you get to verse 23, we're now back into the time period of 158. So is everybody okay with that? That's just revision of what we've already discussed. So what we've seen is that when you go from 14 to 22, it covers a history, and I think yesterday I gave you 202 BC, and if you go to verse 22, I think I marked verse 22 at 31 AD. Because the last part of the verse, it says, also the Prince of the Covenant. Everybody okay with that? Then verse 23, so this is 14 to 22, then verse 23 is going to take you back to around here, 158. This is verse 23. So here we're seeing this, we're going back into history and we're having this repeat and enlarge. And then verse 24 takes you to 31 BC to 330. So verse 24 is going to take you to 31 BC to 330 AD. So if we could go 330, 31, and this is 24. Just want to jump to make a slightly different point, but it's connected. Let's go to verse 30. We've discussed verse 30 at length, and it talks about having intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. So this is verse 30, and it says them. And we've had a date here. We're saying this is 533 to 534 AD. Everybody's familiar with that history?
Is that 330 on the bottom line?
This one here. Mm-hmm. This one here, 330 AD, sorry.
It looks like you've got 310 there, 330 on the line.
On the line. So the them is going to, we understand this to be papal Rome. Yeah, this is the papacy. Verse 31, we looked at verse 31, it says, arms shall stand on his part. So now we have a his. And then it talks about arms standing on his part, and then we go through that history, and what are the dates that we've got? Brother Henry, do you remember the dates we've got? Sister Tiffany, do you remember the dates? Does anybody remember?
335
Sister Slot, I didn't hear what you said.
476.
I can't hear her, sorry.
Sunday law.
Oh, Sunday law. It covers quite a few dates.
508, 530.
Okay, where does it start?
496.
Let's read the verse. An arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, they shall take away the daily, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. So the first thing that's happened is there's a pollution of the sanctuary of strength. This is the city of Rome. City of Rome gets polluted. Sorry?
The arms on his part. The arms shall stand on his part before that. There's an arm shall stand on
Yeah.
his part.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I just don't want to go back into the verse. That's why I'm reticent to address your question.
I'm just saying.
So the arms on his part is do you think it's the first thing?
It is. In the verse.
Okay, because when I brought it up, nobody objected to what I was saying after 2 days of doing it. But you're objecting to what we've already covered. I suggested that arms is saying that an army is going to stand on his part, and then the next statement says this is what it's going to do for them, and what it does for them is 3 specific things. The first thing that happens is they're going to pollute the sanctuary of strength. This is Constantine 330 AD. Then the second thing that it does is take away the daily, 508. Then the last thing that it does is place the abomination that maketh desolate, 538. Now you can put 496 in there, but 496 is going to be the army that does the second piece of work, which is taking away of the daily.
Is it because you want it to go chronological? You want it to read chronologically? Or at least...
Or we're going to say the arms is a plural, so then you have to say who were the armies.
I think we've another example that it's not necessarily chronological. When you have the little horn that grows to the south and the north and the peasant land and the east, it's not chronological.
Yes, I'm not trying to make the verse chronological itself. I'm just trying to say it says that armies are going to stand on his part in the plural. So we want to introduce all of those armies that are going to do that work. And at its most basic level, it's pagan Rome. Pagan Rome is going to stand on its part, but pagan Rome is divided into 2 parts, east and west, and various nations, various emperors over a long history, 200 years, are going to do various things for it.
Oh no, you're right. Actually.
Yeah.
You're actually right. Just by reading it, an arm shall stand on his part, and they, the arms, shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. So whoever the arms is, it has to be at 338.
Yeah.
So,
Brother Michael.
What he just came to the conclusion of is just what I wanted to say, is that grammatically you kind of are forced to read it that way. Because these arms do this thing in 330, so it couldn't be identifying 496 specifically.
So one of the arguments that I'm making about the King of the North is a title that's received before the 3 horns are plucked up, is this. When pagan Rome is introduced, it's introduced by a term which isn't the King of the North. So for pagan Rome it's the robbers, and for papal Rome it's them that forsake the covenant. So it's nothing to do with the title of the King of the North. Then in the very next verse, then they're going to start grabbing this title. So when we get from verse 15 into 16, we're going to see that this title is now going to be addressing the activities of pagan Rome. And you see the same thing with the papacy. It's going to be saying his, and now it goes from them to his in the very next verse, talking about completely different history, but I don't know how to say this, stylistically there's a pattern that first when the power is introduced, it's not identified as the King of the North, but very quickly afterwards, in this case, in the very next verse it says his, and now we still know it's talking about the same power, but now this is talking about the papacy, and it's already received the title of the King of the North. And you see the same thing here. So that's one of the arguments to show that when you get into verse 16, that the title for the King of the North is being handed over to the to pagan Rome in this setting and papal Rome in this setting. First it identifies them as a power that's introduced, and then it gives it the title, the King of the North. Same thing here. So that's one thing that we didn't discuss yesterday. The other thing that I want to just bring up is...
So the his, in verse 31, the very first part there is the papacy, not pagan?
That's the papacy, yes. So what we're going to see is when pagan Rome and papal Rome are both introduced, the first time you see them introduced into these chapters, into these verses, it's identified as some kind of different power. either the robbers or them that forsake the covenant. And then when it discusses them, it switches and starts calling them essentially the king of the north. And remember we said this before, that in Daniel 2 it's so easy to identify the two phases of Rome. Daniel 7, it's still easy, but it's a bit harder. Daniel 8 is much harder. And by the time you get to Daniel 11, you can't identify the two phases of Rome by some kind of imagery or some kind of linguistic technique or going into the words, doing a Hebrew search. There's no way to do that. The only way you can do that is by ploughing through the history. You have to go through the history to be able to identify who is who. Verse 15.
Hold on.
Yeah.
So the papacy is the king of the north from AD 30, AD 330. That's what we're concluding.
What I'm saying is, I'm going to make that. I'm saying that's what the conclusion I'm coming to. But all the verse says is that it goes from some they're introduced, and then it says his. It's called his, which is, we know it's the papacy, and the historical context that's surrounding it. The first portion, it says they should pollute the sanctuary of strength, and the date we're putting on that is 330 AD. So yes, that's where that's the point I want to get to when we get to, I don't know where to put it really. Daniel 8:11, when it comes to the transition between these two powers. This one here, yeah, it would be this one here, Daniel 8:11. Verse 15 says this: "For the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand. Neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand." Verse 15 uses the word king of the north. If you run right through the chapter to verse 39, you never see the term king of the north again. So you have all of these, you have this whole history from, I don't know, is it verse 4 I think it is? Without someone might be able to say, I think it might be about approximately verse 4, mentions the king of the north, then all the way down till you get to verse 15, it's going to mention the king of the north. Then after that, from verse 16 all the way down to verse 39, it just has the pronoun. Never do we see the title king of the north until you get into verse 40. So the only way you can identify when these switchovers happen is by understanding the history that's involved. So let's go back to verse 16, because yesterday, verse 16, I said something that was incorrect. This bit here is to show the parallelism between pagan Rome and papal Rome. So I'm going to rub this off, that you can see that it's showing the same pattern. Robbers of thy people, king of the north. Them, king of the north. Verse 16, the first part says, "But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him." So it said he is going to come against him. And I said this was the subject and this was the object. And that's correct. Then it said he's going to do according to his will. He will do his will. And this his is this same person.
Sorry.
16. Daniel 11:16. "But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him." He is above everyone. Let me put it this way. no one is above him. This him is the same person. And then it says, and he shall stand in the glorious land. He shall stand, and this he is the same person, which by his hand shall be consumed. His hand. All talking about the same person. But the mistake I made yesterday was this. When you go back into verse 15 says the king of the north is going to do something, and then it says, he that comes against him. It's the him here. This is the king of the north. Not this person. So we need to understand 16 in a bit more of an involved fashion. Yes.
When you say pronoun, are we talking about the his and he?
Yes.
And him?
It's a substitute word for the actual name. So John did something, he ran, so that he's referring back to John, but you're not going to use his name.
Just for my notes, are you going to finish that list?
No, I think I'm okay to the end of that list.
Can you repeat the error?
I'm going to repeat that. Yesterday, because I said he was a subject, I said he is referring to the verse before, but it's not. So the he is a brand new person that comes on the scene. This he. How did that come to that conclusion?
He's actually the guy in verse 14. But you're right.
Yeah. So let's read 15. The king of the north shall come and cast up a mount. So I'm just going to leave that there. So the king of the north is going to do something against the king of the south. That's what verse 15 is saying. And then verse 16 says somebody is going to come against him. Someone's going to come against him, and the him is the king of the north in the preceding verse. So this he is this new person that's been introduced, and I don't think you can prove this, but the he is going to be the robbers of thy people. So we know that because of history. You can't show that grammatically. But he's going to be doing all of these things, and it's these activities that he's doing that are going to demonstrate to us that in verse 16 there's a switchover that's occurring. In verse 16, his title for the king of the north is going to be transferred over to him, but you can't see it directly in the verse.
So you say king of the north is there still Greece?
King of the north, I'm just going to say the king of the north is this, because I want to address that issue about Greece as well. Because I want to make sure that we're straight on this issue.
Because he is pagan Rome.
This is pagan Rome.
Yeah.
This is the robbers of thy people.
Yeah.
You can't prove it's robbers of thy people.
But history tells us.
But history's going, yeah. You have to go into history to know who's who. So all I'm saying at the moment is, he's the king of the north, and he is going to end up taking his title from him. So before we move on, I just want to make sure we're settled on that.
What did that say?
Which bit?
None is above him.
No one is above him. That's my kind of paraphrase of what that verse is saying. Because all I want to pick out is the he, his, him, he, his, to show that all of this is talking about this singular person, pagan Rome.
The subject, right?
He's the subject of that sentence.
And that's pagan Rome.
Pagan Rome.
Okay.
And he's going to, the first thing he's going to do is going to come against the king of the north, and then he's going to do all these other activities.
And who was the king of the north at that time?
That was what Brother Arian's question was. I'm just saying the king of the north is the person in verse 15. I'm going to deal with that just as a separate line of study in a minute. But I just want to get the flow correct so that we understand how the grammar and the flow of these verses is working before we go into the history of who the king of the north is. Are we okay with that? Okay, so when you go to the beginning right here of chapter 11, Greece is the king of the north. He's all the way the king of the north, right until you get to verse 15. And then in verse 16, it says someone is going to come against him. The him in verse 16 is still the same king of the north. But there's a lot of history that's going on in verse 16. And in verse 16, that history is going to show us that this person here is going to take his title. But all I'm just addressing at the moment is the flow of words. I've just put verse 16, this is verse 16, I'm just bringing it here on this timeline. This is verse 14 to 22. Have I lost people? Okay. Was that yes?
Yes.
Okay. So let me explain what I'm trying to show. The purpose of this is to show that the title for the King of the North is given or is obtained by Rome before it takes down 3 powers. That's what I'm trying to show. And the verses will demonstrate that. Verse 16 and verse 15 are connected together. They're connected histories. From verse 14 to verse 16, it's just one tight bit of history. And I think I said yesterday it went from 202 to 158. 202 to 158 BC. I gave it just a time period. And then I said you can go right back down to 31 BC. So I've said the same thing now. I've said beginning 202 BC down to 31 AD by the time you get to verse 22. 14 to 22 take you from 202 to 31 AD. That should hopefully be straightforward. Verse 16, someone is going to come against the king of the north. And when this person comes against the king of the north, he's going to do a lot of things. All of these things he's going to do. And then you go into the other verses, verse 17 to 22, and he carries on doing a lot of activity. The history of verse 16 covers a long period of time. And in that time period, this person is going to take his title from him. This person who's pagan Rome is going to take the title of the King of the North from Greece. So hopefully that's clear. Now, so I've corrected the grammar mistake that I made yesterday, that he's the King of the North, but it still doesn't undo anything or the conclusion that we came to. What we need to remember is that we've got this repeat and enlarge. So when you deal with the repeat and enlarge, you have to do 2 things. You have to be able to conceptualize in your mind, you've got 2 things that are overlapping one another. So there's this history here, and then there's this history here, and you can see there's a big overlap between the 2. But the way the verses are written, it doesn't show you that overlap. It just says he, all the way through. Yeah? So when you go to verse 14, then verse 15 and into 16, pagan Rome, Greece, the king of the north. Then it says he, it's going to go he all the way through these verses, he, all the way, you're going to go all the way down to verse 39. So it's going to say he all the way down. Is that okay with everybody? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just going to use this pronoun he all the way through to almost to the end of the chapter. Now verse 24, we know is talking about a new history because it's going back into a repeat, and it begins in 31 BC. So without going back into verse 24, is everybody happy why we begin that in 31 BC? Does everybody know why we begin it in 31 BC? We don't know.
Begin what in 31 BC?
Verse 24 says he's going to forecast his devices from or on top of the city of Rome, even for a time. And that time is a time prophecy of 31 BC to 330 AD. Yeah? We should hopefully be... Sorry? 360 years. And it happens after the 3rd horn is plucked. not third horn, the third territory is taken down. Battle of Actium, now he begins to rule supremely after taking down 3 territories. But verse 24 says this, it says, he. Yeah? If you go through contextually, this him here of verse 16, if you ran through the verses, it says, he that comes against him is going to do all of these things. And then it uses the pronouns, this is verse 16, when you go to 17 all the way to 23, it's going to say basically, he. He's going to be doing all of these things. Who is the he from verses 20, from 17 to 23? It has to be this one here. That one is correct. That is correct. This he is all the way. And now you're in verse 24, and then it says he. So there it says he again. So this he must be this person. So this he is pagan Rome. And pagan Rome, this history begins when?
31. No, when it comes to contact with God's people.
When we get to verse 24, it's 31. But when you go back into this history and include verse 23, you're into 158 because you've got the League of the Jews. So here you've got 158. So he's already being called he in 158 right here. And this he is talking about pagan Rome. But now as we're going through the flow and we're into verse 23, verse 24, we're not identifying this as pagan Rome, we're identifying this as a king of the north. Yeah? All of this history here, the way the verses we understand them, are all talking about the king of the north. So I think that's a reasonably well established understanding of how we read those verses. We're saying the king of the north is going to be doing all of these activities. But the king of the north, this title is taken back here at 158. This should be, let me redo this. This is 22 and 23. I'll put 23 and 24 together. 23 and 24 together is 158, and it goes down into history to 330 basically. So this he here is the king of the north, and it's picked up the history back from 158, and 158 is the same history as verse 16. So what I'm saying is that when you go back with the way you line these verses up, that you can show that in verse 16, he has taken the title from him very early on. And it's not in the time period where you have 64, 63, and 31. This is the east, the glorious land, and the south. And this east here is Syria. And Syria is the Seleucid Empire, which is the king of the north. So this is the Seleucid Empire, who is normally understood to be the king of the north. So what I'm saying is that in verse 16, when it says he is going to come against the king of the north, this history that's being covered spans literally hundreds of years. Maybe just short of 200 years then, 100 plus years. But it includes the history of 158. 158 is tucked into here. But in verse 23 and 24, 158, pagan Rome is being called and identified as the king of the north. So this repeated in large from verses 14 to 22, and then you go from 22 to 24, is a proof to show you that the title for the king of the north is transferred over to pagan Rome before 64 BC. So, if we're okay with that, let me address the other question that was discussed yesterday. We have Greece. No, I'm not going to call it Greece. I want to call it Macedonia. No, let me put it this way. I've got Greece, and there's three parts. There's Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt. This is the king of the north, and this is the king of the south. This is the point that Brother Marco was bringing up yesterday, that Macedonia is not considered to be the king of the north. So when we picked up, and I haven't put it here, the Battle of Pydna, so I'm going to put the Battle of Pydna here, 168, and this is normally considered the transition from Greece, the Empire of Greece, this empire here of Greece, to pagan Rome. 168 is normally considered that date. And Brother Marco's point, correctly, was saying, why are we marking 168 as... So I'm going to put it here, I'm going to put 168 BC. He's saying, why are we marking 168 BC as the title for the king of the north when he takes down Macedonia, when Macedonia was never the king of the north?
Them three territories of Greece.
Yeah. The Empire of Greece. So that was his question. So let me just read some things. These are straight out of Wikipedia. Hopefully I've got it here. Yesterday, I explained from when you go from verses 14 to the first part of verse 16, this is covering this period from, I think I put 202 to what date? 158. Okay, so we've got 158 here, the league between the Romans and the Jews, and 168 would go here, wouldn't it? So this would be 158. It's covering this time period. And this is verse 14, 15 and 6, and the first part of 16. There's a lot of wars and battles that are going on in this time period. So this is, these are just some various portions from Wikipedia. The past century had seen the Greek world dominated by the three primary successor kingdoms of Alexander the Great's empire: the Ptolemaic, Egypt, Macedonia, and the Seleucid Empire. So there's these three separate entities that are going on. Yesterday I explained that there's an alliance between Macedonia and Syria. They're in an alliance together, and they're going to start trying to overtake the world. And one of the people that they want to crush is Egypt. So there's many things that are going on in this time period. First of all, there's these two groups who are coming together, the Macedonians and the Syrians. They're going to have interaction with God's people, they're going to have interaction with Egypt, and they're going to have interaction with pagan Rome. So this is where it gets complicated in a kind of a setting like this, without spending a lot of time going through all the battles and histories, to try and explain what's going on in this history and how transfer of titles go on, because that's essentially what we're interested in. But we've got those three people involved here. Between the years 192 and 188, so let me put that down, 192 to 188. So this is a time period that's in here. There's a war between Rome and Syria. There's a war between the robbers of thy people and the king of the north. So I'm just reading an extract from Wikipedia. It says this: the war was the consequence of a cold war between both powers. This is Rome and Syria, the king of the north and the robbers of thy people. There's a war that's going on, which is the consequence of a cold war between both powers, which had started back in 196. In this period, Romans and Seleucids had tried to settle spheres of influence by making alliances with the Greek minor powers. The fighting ended with a clear victory of the Romans. In the Treaty of Apama, the Seleucids were forced to give up Asia Minor and fell to Roman allies. As a main result of the war, the Roman Republic gained the hegemony or the control over Greece and became the only remaining major power around the Mediterranean Sea. So we've got historical evidence that there's a war that's going on between pagan Rome, the robbers of his people, and the king of the north, which is the Seleucid Empire. So that's 192 to 188. Now I'm going to go to the Battle of Pydna, which is 166. I just want to read what it says here. Talking about this battle. This was not the final conflict between the two rivals, but it broke, which is Rome and Macedonia, but it broke the back of the Macedonian power. So 168, the Macedonian power is broken. And then I want to jump, where do I want to jump to?
$168 because you said before 166.
Oh, I meant that was 168 what I just read. Did I say 166? I meant 168. Battle of Pydna. I'll read again. This was not the final conflict between the two rivals, 168, but it broke the back of the Macedonian power. And now Macedonia is annexed over to pagan Rome. So there's the annexation of Macedonia in 168, and then in 64, Syria is going to be annexed in 64 BC. Annexation means that they're just basically getting taken over. There's one bit here that I wanted to see. Okay, this is 158. This is a story about 158. The treaty between Rome and the Jews was signed during the Maccabean revolt against the Greco-Syrian Seleucid kingdom. So the Greeks, the Macedonians and the Syrians are in this alliance, and they want to have control over Israel, and Israel are going to seek help from Rome. Everybody's seeking help from Rome. The Egyptians are seeking help from Rome, and so are God's people. It says, during this period, Rome's power and influence in the Hellenistic world was growing. Rome had recently humiliated the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, which is Antiochus Epiphanes, by ordering his troops to leave Egypt, and had previously defeated his father, Antiochus III, in battle. Antiochus III is this history here. This is Antiochus III, and then in the time period of the League of the Jews, if I put 161 to 158, 161 is the date that secular people use, this is Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV is Antiochus Epiphanes that we all know of. So it says this, I'll just read it again. It says, during this period, the league between the Romans and the Jews, Rome's power and influence in the Hellenistic world was growing. Rome had recently humiliated Antiochus Epiphanes by making him leave Egypt, and had previously defeated his father, Antiochus III, in battle. After winning a number of victories and capturing Jerusalem, Judas Maccabeus sent two emissaries to establish a treaty of friendship with the Roman Senate. This proposal was accepted and the treaty was signed. So we're all familiar with, you're familiar that this treaty that's going on. So what I'm saying is this. Verse 16, he shall come against him. The him that he's coming against is the king of the north, Syria, the Seleucid Empire, but they're in an alliance with the Macedonians. So historically, you're going to see the struggle between Rome and these two powers, the Macedonians and the Syrians, as being one thing. They're going to make war with the Macedonians, they're going to make war with the Syrians, and that struggle is going to carry on. But prophetically, so we just cut to the chase, that in verse 16, when he comes against him, the struggle that's going on is how pagan Rome is going to take the title of the king of the north from the Syrians. There's sufficient evidence that when you go from Antiochus III to Antiochus IV, that you see him doing that. but most people mark 168 as a watershed moment when all of this thing is all kind of done and dusted and sorted out. So if you're not happy that we'd pick 168, you might want to pick some other date, 158 or 192 to 158, this time period. But I think 168 is the date to go for. But however way you look at it, he's got the title for the King of the North because he's humiliated the Syrians and he's totally defeated the Macedonians.
Is 168 the Battle of Pydna?
Battle of Pydna.
And the Battle of Pydna is in Macedonia.
In Macedonia, what we consider to be Greece today. I call it Macedonia because we get confused. So 168 marks the annexation of Macedonia, and 64 marks the annexation of Syria. So those two dates mark two annexations, and my argument right from the beginning was that historically they're in alliance, but prophetically they're just two things that are together.
What would you say is the requirements to become to receive a title? Because when I think about it, there's been many times when in the end time period of Rome where they'd been completely humiliated or even completely conquered either by barbarians or other groups of people, but those groups of people didn't necessarily receive the title of King of the North. So my question is, what are the prerequisites or whatever to receive a title based upon what you're understanding?
I'm going to say the seat or the throne, but as soon as you do that and you start going into history and you start seeing that the three Aryan powers are going to, at some level, take that throne, it almost appears that it's a self-defeating argument. So I don't have a way of explaining or justifying how you can say that in 455, 483, 476, where these Aryan powers begin to take down or to grab the title, take control of the city of Rome, how we can say that they aren't the King of the North. Prophetically, the title for the King of the North is only brought to view in Daniel 11. It seems really clear that it's talking about three empires that take that title: Greece, pagan Rome and papal Rome. And to me, the most defining verse that's going to show you how you take that title is Revelation 13 verse 2, when pagan Rome gives him his seat. And that seat is 330 AD. It's when he leaves that city and leaves it vacant for the papacy to take hold of that. And the history from 321 to 538 is just the history of how the papacy prophetically is still seated on that throne throughout those 200 years, but he hasn't got full control of everything. So even though it looks like people are coming in and out, he's still got control of all of that that title. Brother Marco.
I still have a stumbling block, because when we go in Daniel 11 back to the last mention of who is the King of the North, or who the King of the North was, then we come to verse 13, where specifically says...
Not verse 15?
Daniel 11:13.
Oh, when you say who, you mean just the name King of the North? Or
who represents the King of the North? What entity? What power?
Let's read verse 13. For the King of the North shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. So verse 15 also mentions the name King of the North as well.
Yeah, but before verse 14.
Yes, I've got no problem. Verse 13 and verse 15, I think it's covering the same
Yeah.
Basically the same history from verse 13 to verse 15.
Yeah.
And so
according to
yeah.
Uriah Smith, this king of the north is Antiochus. Antiochus.
I'm okay with that. That king of the north is this person here. From Antiochus, I think his name is Antiochus Megas, or Antiochus the Great. His Antiochus the Third. He reigns from 2 let me give you his reign. I've got his reign as going from 222 up to 187. That's where he's going to be reigning from. And Antiochus Epiphanes the Fourth, I've got him. I'll have to go. Let me see if I've got that anywhere. $175. Yeah, 175 to 164. 175 to 164. In between that, there's problems going on, but they're the two reigns of those kings. So verse 13 is this history of this king, and it's Antiochus Megas. So I'm in agreement with that. For the king of the north shall return. So what history are you saying that is?
So he is the king of the north.
Yes.
Yes, and this is the last mention of the king of the north before someone else will be called king of the north. Rome, or is it not?
I think verse 15 is the last mention.
Yeah.
But I've got
it's still
yeah, it's still the same person.
Yeah.
Yes, verse 13. This is the last mention of the king of the north.
This is just my stumbling block. So the king of the north is Antiochus. Till the end.
I'm agreeing with that.
Yeah.
Syria is the king of the north. Macedonia is not the king of the north.
Oh yeah, okay.
So I'm okay with that.
Okay, then I missed. Okay.
So the point I'm making is this: in this history, just going from 202 to 158, pagan Rome is going to exalt itself, and when it does that, it's going to come against Macedonia and Syria. It's going to come against both of them. In fact, the Macedonians are just almost a puppet of the Syrians. Sorry, you had your hand up ages ago. I forgot. I didn't.
No, I was going to address Tyler's question, but
Could you remind us what Tyler's question was?
No, I want to go back to what you're saying.
But you don't address his question.
Maybe later, after or something. I can address both.
Okay, address Tyler's question. Tyler's question was, what do you have to do to get the title for the King of the North?
Well, yeah, and he was saying, well, with the fall of the Roman Empire, you see lots of powers humiliating that's where I walked out, but because I was going to the bathroom. But he said that humiliating the pagan Rome, and all of that history of Rome being humiliated by the barbarians and everything takes place after the year after 330, where the papacy's already received the title of the King of the North. So the pagan Rome's not even the King of the North then.
I don't think that was his problem. He was saying
it wasn't that specific history. I'm just saying.
He was just saying generally. How do you get the title? Because if papacy has got it in 330, then other people are going to sit in the city of Rome. So why don't we call them the King of the North? What criteria are we marking?
Yeah.
I think that was his question.
Yep. I don't have it.
Okay, you don't have an answer. Okay.
But what I wanted to say.
Now this is Brother Marco's question,
Yeah.
and his question is what?
Well, he's talking about verse 13 and verse 15, addressing the King of the North specifically as Syria or Antiochus, the Seleucid regime or whatever.
And you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think you agree with it.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is that
could you look at this way, because I don't think it's going to get picked up on the mic.
In verse 13 through 15, we're dealing with Antiochus Magnus, and we know that this power teams up with Philip of Macedonia. So
yes.
This is the point that they're leagued together, and Rome humiliates both of them.
Yes.
That's in this very time, in 201, that time frame, Rome. These two powers are coming against this child king of Egypt, and Rome comes in and obliterates them, and Antiochus runs back with his tail between his legs. So right in that history, he's fighting Syria. Even though it's Macedonia, he's fighting Syria. He's fighting the king of the north. That's what I'm saying. Is that historically he puts Antiochus to shame, and when of whom a man is overcome, to him he's enslaved. He maybe even in the year 201 or whatever. I'm not 100% sure, but I get your point about it culminating at the Battle of Pydna. But my point is that he had already, without subjugating them, he had put them in their place. Rome had.
All I'm marking, these 4 dates, 168, 64, 63 and 31, are all annexation dates.
Yes.
These are dates where Rome basically says, you are under our control supremely. And that's why I marked 168 as opposed to any of the other dates. You know, this humiliation, this subjugation of Epiphany. It's the annexation dates that we're picking up. Yes.
I agree with what you're saying. I'm just saying verse 14, where he stands up against the king of the south. Sorry, no, many shall stand up against the king of the south. This is Philip and Antiochus, and then Rome steps in. From that point forward, no other power is. Rome is controlling pretty much from that point forward.
I got you. Let me just try and finish off addressing Brother Marcus' question. So you can show in this history that pagan Rome is coming against the Macedonians and the Syrians. He annexes Macedonia. That's 168. He doesn't annex Syria. He doesn't annex Syria. He's going to do that over 100 years later. But for me, the proof is in verse 23 and verse 24. Because in verse 23 and verse 24, the way the verses run, they run sequentially, one after the other. It's he all the way down. It's he. So this he is always this person here. And if you were just to read without any history involved in any of this, you'd say that this he is never the king of the north. If you were just to read it grammatically. Because you have the king of the north here in verse 16, him, and then from verse 16, and I've got 24, you could go all the way down to 39. And this he is always going to be this person here. It's never going to be the king of the north. The way the verses, if you were to read the verses just as they write, sorry, it's just as they're written. Hopefully that makes sense. The way it just says he all the way down, and this he you can trace it back to this person here, which is different to this person here. But we're going to skip over all of that, and we're going to say that pagan Rome is the king of the north somewhere along the line. And in verse 23 and verse 24, he's identified as the king of the north. But verse 23 is picked up in 158 back here. So that's the kind of second line of argument that I have to show that.
It's the first line for me. First line of argument.
First line of argument.
This argument makes sense to me, and I can agree that he must be the king of the north already since quite a while, since 158 or so. I just think that the Battle of Pydna hangs kind of loose, because Rome humiliated so many in this time period. So I don't see why at this point he should get the title, you know.
Okay.
This is the only thing. Perhaps we should find a different
maybe we can find a different date. So I'm just explaining the reason why I choose 158. Maybe I've been conditioned by Adventism. Maybe I wanted to fit Adventism's viewpoint on it, but I've picked up the annexation all the way through. It starts with an annexation and it ends with an annexation. These three powers, 1, 2, 3, that's what Rome is going to do. It's going to take down Macedonia, Syria, and then Egypt. And I guess what I'm picking up is the annexation dates. 64 and 31, we know they're annexation dates. So I'm just saying, if we went back to Macedonia, the annexation date is 168. So that's my reasoning, rightly or wrongly. Brother Colette.
I was going to say, we're kind of stuck with two choices. It's either when the rebels of thy people come into contact with God's people at 158, or it's 64 BC, or it's 64 BC.
64 BC.
That's basically our two choices. And either which way, he becomes the king of the north before 31 BC. So that in itself, to me, surely that should be enough proof anyway. I would have thought.
Everybody's agreement, he's the king of the north before he takes down the last territory. The question is, was he king of the north before he takes down the first? So my argument, my point is, it's before the first one that he gets that title. Sister Tanya.
I have a question. We made a lot of application before the cross is literal, after the cross is spiritual. And when he came to the, the power of Egypt, we placed him in the location of the south. So being the king of the south was a little application for Egypt. I'm having a hard time placing that with the east as saying Syria being king of the north.
In verse 9 of Daniel 8, you got a problem here where I've said the east is the king of the north.
Is that maybe it's wrong with the assumption that we're having that before the cross is literal, and after the cross is I guess.
The power that controls literal Babylon and the power that controls literal Egypt are the characteristics that we've usually applied to who's king of the north and king of the south. So Syria at that time controlled the territory of Babylon, and the Ptolemy Empire regime controlled Egypt.
Brother Mark.
I think this is easy because it's in Daniel 8 it's the horn, and the horn goes east. The horn comes from Rome and it goes to the east. Syria was in the east from Rome, Roman perspective, right?
Yeah.
But in the other verse,
but the Syria,
it's the king of the north. It's from the perspective of Israel.
Let me just explain his answer. Let him just explain his answer. Had you recap that again? Just because maybe.
In chapter 8, the perspective is from Rome. We look from Rome. And if you would draw you a nice map.
I thank you down there.
You can finish.
I think that's what Brother Marco is saying. But I don't know if that addresses your question. Was that your question?
I think Michael make it clear. Basically, we're going from Babylon was king of the north, correct?
Yes.
And then whoever conquered Babylon becomes also the king of the north.
And who was that? The Medes and the Persians.
Right. And
Yeah. Because they're called the king. I think there's a passage.
So Syria is part of the Medes of the Persians?
No.
Who are the Syrians then? Are they part of the Greece Empire?
Okay, so not looking at the geography, if we think about empires, if we think about there's this territory here, which is the world, the known world, not Australia and South America. It's the known world that we're focusing on. Everybody wants to grab of that territory. So first it's Babylon that takes that territory. Maybe not all of it, but most of it. Then the Medes and Persians, then the Greeks. So when we think about Syria, when we use the term Syria, we're not thinking about Syria as in the Bible, like Damascus and Rezin and those kind of nations that are discussed in the Old Testament. We're talking about Syria as a piece of geography, like Iraq, Syria, Iran. We're talking about geography. So when we're talking about Syria now, we're talking about a territory that's owned by Greece that it grabbed from Persia, essentially. That's what's being discussed here. And the reason why it's called the East in verse 9 is what Brother Marco said. It's to do with direction. Because there's some complexity in verse 8 to verse 9 of Daniel chapter 8 when it says he's going to come out of one of them. People that argue, who's he coming out of? Pagan Rome, who does he come out of?
Well, he comes out of the four winds.
Yeah, the four winds. As soon as you get the four winds, you get direction, which is what I think he's trying to identify. This is direction. The north, the east and the south. It's coming from a direction. It's coming from the west. So I'm picking up the annexation dates But even if we didn't pick up the annexation dates, I think it's correct to say that pagan Rome has got the title for the King of the North here. And when we come to modern Rome has already got the title for the King of the North before he takes down the 3 territories that we mentioned that yesterday. And so when we come to this history of Papal Rome before the deadly wound, when it takes down these 3 horns, do we remember the dates? (493), 534, and 538. The Heruli, Vandals, and Ostrogoths. He's already given his seat in 330 AD. And the logic that I have for that is that this is Revelation 13, verse 2. Revelation 13, verse 2, he's given his seat, and he receives that in 330 AD, and the seat is connected to the title of the King of the North. So that was a recap of the preamble to Daniel chapter 8, verse 11. The reason why we spent a lot of time on that is because I wanted everybody to be in agreement with it. I wanted to correct this mistake that I'd made yesterday about this he is not the King of the North, this is the King of the North. This he runs all the way through, and you can show that it's going to drop you back into history, and it's still calling it the same person. And so therefore he must have been the King of the North somewhere in this verse, very early on. The reasoning about all of these dates, and a bit more about the history. This history is not just about the defeat of the Macedonians in 168. There's this severe conflict between Rome and the Seleucid Empire. In fact, the way it was written in Wikipedia, the inference was that the 2 people who were warring was Rome and Syria. The Macedonians were just kind of an ally of this power. So when Rome is defeating an ally of the Syrians, it's in effect having this blow against these people. But you see real wars against them. We identified humiliation here and the defeat that's going on here.
I agree with this point, but back to Tyler's question, now I'm kind of confused, because I just remembered, as Tanya was asking, about Syria, and my answer was Babylon, the power that controls Babylon, the power that controls Egypt. We've identified that that's how you identify the King of the North. So he's battling against Syria, he defeats Macedonia, he makes this, he really is powerful, and we know historically that he just stays, pretty much just keeps gaining power. But he actually doesn't control Babylon for a long time. So is our rule about the power that controls Babylon and the power that controls Egypt maybe too stringent?
Is that the point you were trying to make, Sister Tanya?
No, I don't think she's making that point.
Were you going to pick up?
Oh, maybe she was.
I thought that's why I thought it was. That's why I thought it wasn't.
Because we're going from little to spiritual, and in that process, we need to be able to identify the little in order to figure out how it runs.
So where do you see Babylon in this story?
Just the fact that we've identified that Babylon is the power that controls literal Babylon is the King of the North. That's how we've always.
And where do you want us to identify that? In this history, because Syria is not Babylon.
Yes, it's what Syria controls the territory of Babylon. So my point being that we've always applied it that until the territory of literal Babylon is under control, that power isn't the King of the North, and until the territory of Egypt is under control, that power isn't the King of the South.
So if we use that reasoning, then...
I'm not saying it's correct. I'm saying that's the reasoning.
When you come to this history, then you'd have the same problem, because you might have No. You might have the city, but you don't have the territory. Because the way you mentioned, if I understood it correctly, you've got to have a grab of that territory, or not. Or it doesn't just have to be that.
No, I don't know. That's just the way that Uriah Smith has applied it, and I'm okay with that not being the hard and fast rule, but that has been the rule that we've employed to identify who's north or who's south, is who's got the control of Egypt and who's got the control of Babylon. So anyways, it's just thrown into the mix because I understand the logic that we're employing,
but more problems into the mix.
It's definitely a rule that's going to come up when we're addressing this. That's been the rule, so now we have to kind of address how is that power in control of the territory of Babylon, or do we have to address that? I don't know.
What does annex mean?
Annex means enlarge. It means enlarge your. I think it just means enlarge if you annex something. Or no, I think it means to add.
You add.
It means to add. Annex means to add.
So why is it there? What's the significance of it being there? Sorry, because I came back from the bathroom and I saw.
Okay. But no, the annex was there a long time ago.
I came back and it was there. Seriously.
Anyway, it was there. It's been there for nearly half an hour. Brother Stemo, what you saying? You're looking at the definition.
Yeah, it just means to append or add as an extra or subordinate part.
Okay, so I've just put annex means to add. So you've got some geography, and then you're going to add something onto it, and that's what annex means.
Annexation.
Sorry?
Well, what's the difference with conquering?
Why
are you using annex and not?
This is the term that's used in conquering.
Okay, yeah, you could use conquering, I guess.
Okay.
It's just a term that I guess I've read most people. I think even Uriah Smith used it. It's a common term.
It's a common term.
168, Macedonia is owned by Greece. But owned by Rome.
Yeah.
He owns Greece. Then he's going to own Syria. Then he's going to own Egypt. It's how he's going to take down Greece. It starts in 168, and it's a 3-step process.
Wasn't there always a rule of thumb? I mean, rule of saying that if you win the capital, then you win the country.
Win the capital, win the country, and that's what Brother Michael is saying. Because what capital do you want to have? Do you want to have the capital of Macedonia, or you want to have the capital of Syria? Which is Brother Marco's question right back from the beginning. Because if we're going to mark him as the king of the north, his capital is over here, not over there. And
His capital isn't even Babylon, isn't it?
No, it's not. That's what I'm saying. It's probably Damascus, but you're saying wherever your capital is, then you take the capital, you take the territory. But I don't know if it's that straightforward. The reason why I've seen Brother Gabriel's hand up is that there's these transition periods. This is Greece, this is pagan Rome, and this is papal Rome. Maybe I'm wrong, or maybe we need to reevaluate how we grapple with this. What you're going to take down to identify that you're now ruling is that these transition periods are complicated and messy. And I guess simplistically, I'm saying right here, you take the title King of the North. And then there's this history of, I'm going to use the phrase setting up. So you take the title, then you get set up. And then here, I'll just put R for rule. King of the North, you set up and you rule. And maybe that breaks the way with this nice, clean way of looking at things.
Are we trying to make that application the same with when Jesus came and he received the title, not the title as a king, but when he received, I don't know.
I don't know either. Brother Gabriel.
Yeah.
Well, my question has been answered.
Okay.
But maybe to call it, recently Russia annexed
Crimea.
the island of Crimea to their territory. That's how they call it in the news. It's the annexation of Crimea.
And what I'm saying is, for modern Rome, the same thing is happening. If this is the papacy, then we have modern Rome coming here. It's already the king of the north. It's going to be set up in this time period, and then it's going to rule. No,
What are you marking as that first day?
for which history?
For modern Rome, the last one right there.
Okay, for modern Rome.
Go ahead, Marcus. If we could nail you down real quick.
Okay, so Brother Codif, what are you saying?
I'm saying we already, before Zedekiah was taken over, the king of the north, there was a threat put on the Israelites, or whatever you want to call them. It's called Israelites for argument's sake. That there's a king from the north is going to come and it's going to basically take over you and subjugate you to, the 2520. So, but Ellen White says that Zedekiah was, the crown was taken from Zedekiah. So we can see that before the crown is officially taken, there can be a king of the north there. So before the crown is officially taken from Syria, there can be a king of the north there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think it answers your question properly, Sister Tanya,
Well,
before, but if you've got another question, go
No, I
ahead.
was going to say it was Daniel 7:14 that I was referring to
Okay.
earlier. Are we going to...
What's the point?
But because
So that-
this is, like you said, that he gets the title before he actually conquers the territory.
Okay, so you're going back to 1844, I think, and you're saying
No, the pattern. I'm looking
yes.
the
So
pattern.
yeah, so that's what I mean. You're going back to let me.
Yeah, when Jesus received dominion, glory, and kingdom.
So you're going back to 1844, and you're saying the way it's worded,
Yeah.
he received the title. So I don't know. I was going to put King of the North, but I'll probably get in trouble.
But he is a true king of the
Yeah, that's why I was going to put him down, but
Because that's
I'll put title here. He gets his title, but it's a way down the road that
Or said he was given dominion, glory, and kingdom.
that's going to happen. So where would we put Daniel 12:1? I don't know. I'd normally put it at Daniel 12:1, where he changes his garments.
Right.
That he receives. That's how I've understood it. I may be wrong on that, but if he changes his garments, he's going to have his crown, which is already his, back here. It's going to be placed upon his head. So I kind of see this as this setting up, and I think, without understanding all the intricacies, that all this issue about the title being of the King of the North before these things happen are probably going to play into this issue here that you're bringing up. That you already got the crown, but it takes some time period for it to be set up until you're actually wearing it and start. Because here he's going to start ruling.
Yeah, and that's the counterfeit. I mean,
Yes.
the enemy. So I'm just saying, if that's what's ruling, what's happening with the enemy.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's time to close, and your question skillfully helped me to evade Brother Tyler's question. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your loving kindness and your goodness towards us. We ask and pray that you would be with us and bless us. Father, I want to pray for the Holy Spirit. Lord, as we talk about these histories, these dates, these jugglings of numbers, Lord, as I see the faces of some of my brothers and sisters, I see consternation and lack of clarity, Father, bemusement in some faces. And I know that if that's happening here in this small group, there are many people who are watching these studies who must be experiencing the same. Father, may we never lose sight the purpose of what we're doing. We're trying to understand the work of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ as he does a work in us that will transform us from the people that we used to be, the people that we are now, into a people that will reflect and glorify his name, that we truly might be called the sons of God. Father, help us to see in these histories your working and your dealing not only in the lives of these ancient men, but in our own lives. Father, please be with us and please bless us. We ask and pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.